Hello guys, welcome back to your English manual. This is the chapter 4 of our Common Mistakes series. In this chapter, we're going to talk about an aspect of the genitive case of English, which is the use of the apostrophe S. I think many people have heard about it, but students almost always have questions regarding this. And just a heads up, this is going to be a long video full of information, but it's just because we want to give you the most complete information we can. But just to remind you, all of our videos are divided by topics, and we always put the index on the screen and in the description of the video, so if you want to go straight to some specific part, you can easily do that. But if you have some time, we really recommend you watch the whole video so you can have the most complete information. Now, let's explain exactly how this works, right? Well, before we explain this, we have to start by saying what the genitive case is, right? In a language, each word has its grammatical function. Some of them can be the subject, the object, anyways. You guys remember what a subject and an object are, right? We talked about them in our first videos. If you don't remember, we left a link in the description that will help you understand this video. But what happens is, for a change, human beings like to name things, right? To make it easier to identify them. But these names are only classifications. You don't need to memorize them. We're just explaining to you so you have a basis to understand what each thing is. Moving on. Every language has its cases, and many languages have a lot of cases. Old English, just like German, had only 5 cases: nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, and instrumental. Each case identifies a grammatical function. For example, whenever a word functioned as a subject, we said that it was in the nominative case. In other words, it gave the name of the thing. The subject pronouns, for example, are in the nominative case. In Brazilian Portuguese, we call them another name, pronomes pessoais do caso reto. Reto is another word for nominative. If you don't remember what subject pronouns and object pronouns are, we left a link in the description. The accusative case accused the object of the sentence. The object pronouns, for example, are in the accusative case. In Brazilian Portuguese, they are called pronomes pessoais do caso oblíquo. The dative case, however, comes from the act of giving, so that it's usually the indirect object of the verb. We also have this in Portuguese. See? We use things and we don't even know it. And the languages are more alike than we think sometimes. But anyway, let's come back. Old English had these 5 cases, but modern English is very different from Old English. And thank God, because Old English was much more complicated. You can imagine, since it was much more like the modern German. Nowadays, many grammarians say that English has only 3 cases: the subjective, the objective, and the genitive. The subjective encompasses the old nominative case. Therefore, it deals with the subject and the complement of the subject of a sentence. The objective speaks of all the objects, that is, direct object, indirect object, and object of the preposition. Therefore, it encompasses the old accusative, dative, and instrumental cases. And then we have the genitive case. Let's understand this case now. People usually remember the genitive case because of the apostrophe s. It's almost certain. If you ask someone what the apostrophe s indicates in English, they will most likely respond to you, possession. That's why a lot of people call the genitive case the possessive case. But we prefer not to call it that because this apostrophe s will not necessarily indicate ownership. In fact, it indicates that there is some kind of relationship between the two words. Well, okay, usually this relationship is in fact possession, but it can also be other things, such as kinship, Ivan's brother, origin, the Hollywood's actors, description, the women's bathroom, part, whole, the athlete's leg, measurement, the ship's length. Anyways, as you can see, this apostrophe s can also be used to indicate the origin or a characteristic of something, not necessarily ownership. But please notice that the genitive case is not only the apostrophe s. Using the preposition of to indicate ownership or a relationship between things is also part of the genitive case. But first, before we learn when to use each one, do you guys know where this apostrophe s came from? Well, as we said, long ago we had the so-called Old English, which was much more complicated than the English we have today. And one of the reasons it was so complicated is because it had many more changes to the words, called inflections. But relax, don't focus on the name, okay? Do you remember our video about subject pronouns and object pronouns? Well, each one has its grammatical function, right? The subject pronouns function as the subject, and the object pronouns as the object. Well, the thing is, pronouns undergo changes, called inflections, to stay in that function. If we want the pronoun me, which is an object, to be the subject of the sentence, it changes to I. If we want I to become the object, it undergoes change to me. Simple, right? Well, in the past, almost all the words had changes for each of the 5 cases. But over time, nouns, verbs, adjectives, etc., almost all these words lost these changes and became much simpler. Virtually only the pronouns still kept some of them in modern English. So, well, actually, there is still no consensus about the origin of the apostrophe s, but a fairly accepted hypothesis says that in an English a little older than ours, in order to change a noun to the genitive case, people added the suffix es. If we wanted to change the noun man to the genitive case, it would be mens, of men. If we wanted to say the wife of the man, it would be the man's wife. This is very similar to modern German, since the origin of these two languages is the same. But what happens is that the French language ended up influencing English. And one of the things that changed is a characteristic of the French language of placing an apostrophe to indicate when a letter had been abbreviated. Therefore, over time, the suffix es became simply apostrophe s, since the apostrophe replaced the letter e. Interesting, right? Now let's get back to the uses. As a rule of thumb, when we are talking about people or animals, the genitive case can be formed with the apostrophe s or with the preposition of. The of form can always be used actually. So if you are in doubt about using the apostrophe s or of, it may be better to choose of. As weird as it may sound sometimes, right? Nevertheless, with people or animals, it's much more common to use the apostrophe s because it flows better, it uses fewer words. And this can only happen because in theory, people and animals can own something. And so I can say both, for example, I forgot John's wallet, or I forgot the wallet of John. But the first way is much more common. Another example, the wolf's territory is here, and the territory of the wolf is here. Now, companies, groups, and organizations can use the apostrophe s too, because they are considered a set of people. So, it's possible to say, for example, I love all Microsoft's products. Okay? Other examples. The company's staff is very efficient. The army's weapons are modern. We have to focus on our team's goals. I disapprove of the government's decisions. This school's teachers are wonderful. Maybe based on a similar reasoning, places, countries, and celestial bodies can also receive the apostrophe s. For example, Brazil's size is continental. The moon's gravity affects Earth. The world's temperature rises every year. New York's Central Park is known worldwide. On the other hand, a plant or an object cannot own anything, right? Therefore, with plants and objects, as a rule of thumb, you should only use the of form. For example, you should not say the car's door is closed, unless you are so passionate about the car that you kind of treat it like a person. I don't know. Generally speaking, people don't say that. In general, people just say the door of the car is closed. In the same way, you should not say the tree's fruit is delicious. You should just say the fruit of the tree is delicious. Another example. This is the part of the book that I like. Well, there are exceptions actually regarding the apostrophe s. For example, you can use it when you talk about time. We can say, all in a day's work. Today's news shocked me. Yesterday's work was productive. I need to study for tomorrow's test. I want to forget about last week's events. We need to discuss this at Monday's meeting. That's why this structure is also common on some famous dates, such as New Year's Eve, New Year's Day. Well, those rules are more like guides, to be honest. You guys will understand many things with time. The rules for using the apostrophe s are actually simple. The general rule is, we add the apostrophe s to the word that possesses or that is related to another thing. For example, if I want to say the book of my father, I can say my father's book. Since it's my father that owns the book, he is the one that receives the apostrophe s. Another example, the cell phone of Gabi. We say Gabi's cell phone. We put the apostrophe S on Gabi because she is the one who owns the cell phone. Quite simple, right? So let's see other examples. Your mother's house is near. We have to buy the dog's food. The woman's hair is beautiful. I use Carla's computer, etc. However, sometimes the owner of something is written with two or more words. For example, the President of the USA, my sister-in-law, or another person. But this is really simple actually, if you think about it. The President of the USA is only one person. The same goes for my sister-in-law and another person. Even though it's more than one word, all of them together are talking about the same person. This is called group genitive, since it's a group of words that refer to the same thing. And the rule is very simple. You just have to put the apostrophe S at the last word of the group. So, let's see the examples. The President of the USA's attitudes are questionable. I admire my sister-in-law's abilities. And I think this is another person's dish. But be careful not to confuse it with the plurals. The plural is formed in the main word. Let's put the examples we had given into plural. The presidents of the USA's attitudes are questionable. I admire my sisters-in-law's abilities. And I think this is other people's dish. Alright? This is the general rule, but what if there is more than one object and more than one owner? For example, if I want to say, the cars of Jessica and Lara are red, please notice that we're talking about two cars, Jessica's car and Lara's car. Each girl has its own separate car. Since each one of them owns something separately, we must add an apostrophe to each of them. So, the sentence is, Jessica's and Lara's cars are red. Other examples. Your brother's and your sister's rooms are dirty. Men's and women's clothes are on sale. Ricardo's and Paula's parents travel a lot. So, just to remember, since each one has their own separate thing, we add the apostrophe S to everyone, okay? And it doesn't even have to be just two owners. There may be more. For example, Anna's, Vitoria's, and Mauricio's jobs are difficult. Okay. We know we add the apostrophe S to the owner of something. But what happens when more than one person owns one thing? Who receives the apostrophe S? For example, let's imagine that João and Maria decided to buy an apartment together. If I want to say the apartment of João and Maria is big, should I add the apostrophe S to João or to Maria? Well, it's quite simple actually. Remember the group genitive, a group of words that talks about one person only? If you think about it, this is basically what happens with the joint possession. Since we're talking about something that belongs to two people, it's as if these two people were a group, and the thing belongs to that group. Just like in the group genitive, you just have to add the apostrophe S to the last person in the group. In this case, the sentence is, João and Maria's apartment is big. Other examples.
Pedro and Paulo's children are polite, since we're talking about children whose parents are both Pedro and Paulo. My dog and my cat's toys are on the floor, since both my dog and my cat have the same toys. And of course, it doesn't have to be only two owners. The rule is the same. If it is joint possession, always place the apostrophe s only in the last name. For example, Carl, Tina, and Peter's business is profitable. Now, pay attention. We have to use the apostrophe s in the right place, otherwise it may become confusing in some cases. When we talk about joint possession, it may be that two or more people have one thing together, in the singular. Since it's only one thing, that is, it comes in singular, it's clear that we're talking about joint possession, since it's impossible for each person to have their own thing if there is only one thing, right? In the example we gave, João and Maria's apartment is big, there is only one apartment, so obviously we're saying that it belongs to João and Maria together. However, when we have more than one object, it may be confusing if we use the apostrophe s wrong. For example, what if João and Maria together had more than one apartment? The sentence would be, João and Maria's apartments are big, meaning João and Maria have more than one apartment together, and these apartments are big. Since it is joint possession, we put the apostrophe s only in the letter, which is Maria in this case. But if we say João's and Maria's apartments are big in the plural, the natives in general will understand that João has an apartment and Maria has another apartment and both apartments are big. If you want to say that João alone has more than one big apartment and Maria alone has more than one big apartment, it's better to use another structure to avoid confusion. To solve the problem in a simple way, you can repeat the word, for example, saying João's apartments and Maria's apartments are big. See? Be careful, okay?
But then we have one of the most frequent questions about this subject. What about when the word ends in s? Do we add the apostrophe s and then there would be two s's? Well, it depends. Certain words in English, even though they are singular, end naturally in s, such as princess, class, bus, witness, boss, etc. In this case, there is no consensus among scholars, but a widely used method is simply to add the apostrophe s to these common words. So we actually have two s's. Here's some examples. He wants the princess's love. I need to get the class's attention. I don't know the bus's route. He listened to the witness's story. I don't understand my boss's decisions.
Well, but then we also have the fact that in English in general, the plural is made just like in Portuguese, adding the suffix s. Since this is the common way, we call it regular plural. And the rule in this case is very clear. If the word ends in s because it's in the plural, we don't need to add another s. So we'll just add the apostrophe. For example, if I want to say, I used the makeup of my sisters, I should say, I used my sister's makeup. Please notice that sisters is the plural of sister. To put this word in plural, we simply add the s. So we don't have to add another s there, just to indicate possession. We just need to put the apostrophe. But be careful, the apostrophe always comes at the end of the word. If you put it before, you'll be saying something else. Look at the difference. I used my sister's makeup, and I used my sister's makeup. See? Since we only put the apostrophe after the word is over, you can differentiate between singular and plural, right? If the word is sister, the possessive becomes sisters, because we only put the apostrophe s after the word. But if the word is sisters, the possessive becomes sisters, because the word only ends in the s, so the apostrophe only comes after the s. Alright? Other examples. The worker's salary is great, and the worker's salary is great. I always go to my friend's house. I always go to my friend's house. The girl's uniform is beautiful. The girl's uniform is beautiful.
Now, in English, the plural is not always formed by putting the suffix s at the end of the word. There are the so-called irregular plurals. They have this name because there is no rule that defines how the plural will be. It's not just putting the suffix s. For example, the plural of woman is not womans, it's women. Since we did not put the suffix s to form the plural of this word, then it's okay to add the apostrophe s, right? We're not repeating anything. Therefore, these irregular plurals follow the same general rule. That is, we simply add the apostrophe s. For example, the women's bathroom is over there. Another example is the plural of child, which is children. We can say, my children's toys are everywhere. Another example is the plural of person, which is people. If we put it in the genitive case, we should say, for example, this is many people's dream. But then there is one detail. We've seen how the apostrophe s works with common nouns. But what about proper nouns that already end in s? Like the name James, for example. Then what? Do they follow the general rule? That is, we must add the apostrophe s, making it James's? Or do we just add the apostrophe, making it James? Well, here there is still no consensus either, but one of the most used ways is simply to add the apostrophe s. Therefore, the possessive of James is James's. With Thomas, we have Thomas's. With Charles, we have Charles's, and so on. Examples. She wants to go to James's party. Thomas's sister studies here. Charles's car is expensive. Now, there's just one thing. People used to argue that some of the more classical and religious names should not have to follow this rule. With names such as Jesus, Moses, Sophocles, Hercules, Tiradentes, Archimedes, we would only put the apostrophe. So let's see some examples. They followed Jesus' teachings. My son loves to hear about Hercules' tales. Sophocles' plays are incredible. That's been changing a bit lately, so I think it would be okay to add the apostrophe s too. But if you would rather not risk it, feel free. Oh, right. There's another thing that we think it's important to talk about because it's very common. So far, when we talked about using the apostrophe s, we always talked about using it along with a noun. But it's also very common, especially in spoken language, to not say the noun after the possessive in certain situations when the person can understand with the context. We do the same thing in Portuguese. Wanna see it? If I say, eu fui para o Pedro estudar. Did I go to Pedro? The person? Of course not, right? I went to Pedro's house. But I didn't even have to say the word house. You could understand without it, couldn't you? In English, we can do pretty much the same thing. Here's an example. We can say both I went to Pedro's house to study and I went to Pedro's to study. This is because when I say I went to Pedro's to study, we can easily understand that it was Pedro's house. You can understand this because of the apostrophe s. The apostrophe s is there to indicate that it's something that belongs to Pedro. You know it's his house because of the context. If I say my tablet is slow, but Fernando's tablet is fast, do I need to repeat the word tablet? No. It's the same thing. We can say my tablet is slow, but Fernando's is fast. Here, am I saying that Fernando is fast? No, because we have the apostrophe s. So I'm talking about something that belongs to Fernando. But what? His tablet, using the context. Other examples. This is not my book, it's Maria's. I prefer my sandwich to Paulo's. The teacher's job is important, but the student's is also important. Now, guys, please just be careful and don't forget the apostrophe s in that kind of structure. It's precisely the apostrophe s that permits this kind of interpretation using the context. Please notice that it's quite different to say, I prefer my sandwich to Paulo's, and then to say, I prefer my sandwich to Paulo. There's no way I prefer a sandwich to a person, right? At least I hope not. And definitely don't forget the apostrophe s in this is not my book, it's Maria's, and end up saying this is not my book, it's Maria. There's no way Maria can be a book, right? Well, you guys understand. Remember the apostrophe s. There is one more interesting structure to talk about. We have already talked about two possible ways of speaking in the genitive, with the preposition of and with the apostrophe s. But what if I told you that there is a structure that uses both forms at the same time? Yes, it exists and it's called double genitive, for obvious reasons, right? Well, the structure is very simple. You start with the preposition of, then you put the word with the apostrophe s, but without the noun next to it. Here's an example. He is a friend of Marcelo's. Please notice that we have both of, and Marcella's. Again, scholars disagree on this structure. There are people who consider it wrong. Others don't. But the truth is that it's a very old structure in the language, so it's likely to remain.
But then you may ask, why put two possessives? Why not just say, he is a friend of Marcelo, or he is Marcelo's friend? Well, yeah, those two sentences are correct. However, in certain situations, this structure may make the sentence easier to understand. For example, if instead of using an example with the word friend, we used one with the word picture, the situation would be different. For example, saying this is a picture of Carla or this is Carla's picture is different from saying this is a picture of Carla's. In the first two sentences, it's ambiguous. We can understand that Carla is in the picture or that the picture belongs to her. In the other structure, we necessarily said that this photo, which can be of a house, of an animal, anything, belongs to Carla. In other words, this structure can be very useful to avoid certain confusions. Although it's not always necessary, it's good to know that it exists and how to use it, since many people use it. Many scholars argue that a possible explanation for the double genitive would be the idea of saying a part of the whole. What do you mean? Look, when I say he is a friend of Marcelo's, it's as if I'm saying he is one friend among Marcelo's friends. That is, he's just one friend within the group of Marcelo's friends. He is only a part of the bigger group. It's like we're saying he is one friend among Marcelo's friends, or even he is one of Marcelo's friends, you know? And that idea makes sense because the double genitive allows us to make some structures. We can specify the friend, for example, by saying, this friend of John's is funny. We can't say, this John's friend is funny. This sentence is wrong. With this structure, we can also specify the amount, for example, by saying, two friends of Carla's are coming to the party. We can't say two Carla's friends are coming to the party. Well, you can kinda see how it implies that we're talking about a part of the whole, right? Well, maybe that's not the correct explanation of where this structure came from, but it's a possibility.
But anyways, we need to practice this structure more to understand how it works, right? So let's look at other examples. Roberto is an employee of my father's. She is an acquaintance of his sister's. A student of Mr. Parker's did this. This is a shirt of my brother's. But it doesn't even have to be in singular. Look, I need to take two friends of George's to the park. After all, the idea is the same. We have a group of friends of George, and I have to take two of them to the park.
Well, as strange as it may seem, it's possible to put more than one word with apostrophe s one after the other. For example, we know that we can say, I went to my mother's store, right? Here, we are saying that the store belongs to my mother. But what if the store belonged to my mother's friend? Then, in that case, the sentence would be, I went to my mother's friend's store. Weird, right? But this structure is grammatically correct. In theory, we can give examples with even more than two possessives. We could say, for example, your father's, boss's, lawyer's advice is correct. But this kind of structure is not so common, maybe for obvious reasons. It's kind of hard to understand what a person meant, right? Especially when there are three possessives, one after the other. So, even though it's grammatically correct, it's best to keep at most two possessives, okay? So it won't be too difficult to understand.
The last thing we think it's important to talk about is pronunciation. After all, is there a difference in pronunciation between using the apostrophe and using the apostrophe s? Yes, but calm down, it's not as difficult as you may think it is, because the apostrophe alone has no sound. It's just a written representation, nothing else. So, if you add only the apostrophe, the pronunciation of the word doesn't change. And since the apostrophe has no sound, if you add apostrophe s, you are basically, at the end of the day, just adding the sound of the letter S. That is, the pronunciation of the apostrophe S is the same pronunciation of the regular plurals. But the thing is that in English, the regular plurals can have three sounds, depending on the final sound of the word in singular. The sounds can be s, z, or is. We will not go into too many details about pronunciation for now, because we're still going to make videos explaining each sound very well. So for now, let's just see the three possible sounds, okay?
The first possible sound is the sound s, that is, just the sound of the s. We'll have the sound when the word in singular ends with an unvoiced consonant sound, probably because the s sound is also unvoiced, making it easier to say both sounds together. The unvoiced consonant sounds are p, t, k, h, th. Let's see an example for each one. Philip, Phillips. Cat, cats. Jack, jacks. Chief, chiefs. Beth, baths. The second possible sound is the z sound, that is a sound of z. We'll have the sound when the word in singular ends with a voiced sound, probably because the z sound is also voiced, making it easier to say both sounds together. And what is a voiced sound? Well, any vowel or diphthong sound is voiced. For example, we have Carla, which becomes Carla's, and J, which becomes J's. But besides these sounds, we have the voiced consonant sounds. The voiced consonant sounds are B, D, G, V, M, N, N, O, Th. Let's see an example for each sound. Bob, bobs. Dad, dads. Dog, dogs. Steve, steves. Mum, mums. Son, sons. King, kings. People, peoples. Actor, actors. Tithe, tithes. So, as you can see, many times the apostrophe S will sound like Z, in fact. The third and final sound is. It is only used with certain sounds called sibilants, which are S, Z, Sh, J, Ch, and J. Let's see an example for each sound. Waitress, waitresses. Jones, Joneses. Fish, fishes. Mirage, mirages. French, Frenches. Judge, judges. So guys, I don't know if you notice it, but most of the times that you use the apostrophe S, that S actually has a Z sound. Not always, of course, but often. There are only a few times when it will actually have an S sound.
And oh, for those of you who didn't like the parts where we said that there is still no consensus, unfortunately the language is like that. What's usually recommended is that since there is still no consensus, if you have to write a text, for example, choose a style and stick to it throughout the whole text. No one can say you're wrong, don't worry. And finally, we have today's challenge. Is the sentence, I bought it at Peter's family's doctor's son's store, correct? And the answer is yes. Oddly enough, it's possible to put 4 or more possessives with apostrophe S, one after the other. It gets pretty confusing to understand, especially in a spoken conversation, so it's best to avoid it, okay? But well, this sentence means I bought it at the store of the son of the doctor of the family of Peter. Cool, huh? Well, that's it guys. This video was very long and full of information. So whenever you need, come back and see again the part that you are in doubt, okay? Just to remind you that all of our videos have the topics tagged, so it's really easy to go exactly to the part you want. Anyways, we recommend you do the exercises we left in the description of the video. We really hope you have learned and liked it. If so, please leave a like and share this video. You can help us help more people to learn this. See you next video.